You've read a little bit of stuff of mine. I've read a little bit of stuff of yours. We know each other through the MFA program. You aren't a person who just came to graduate school out of college.
No.
You had a life. You lived in Quebec and worked as a journalist for a number of years. As a student, of course, at your stage of life, I would assume this is real, like, this is not my permanent life. I'm not a student forever, and I had this other life as a professional working person. I've thought about it a lot because I'm a half-time faculty member here, and it served me very well to be able to work with students, to be able to work with other people interested in some things, writing, say, that I'm committed to, talk to people, hear what they have to say, hear visiting writers read, meet students who have very different views maybe than mine, and just gain a lot as a result of that. But it's been also crucial for me to have another life that often I think of as simply as physical life, a more physical life. The ranch work is a very physical life, and that has fueled writing for me. So maybe because of my own life and thinking about the various forms writing has come to me, and the questions I've asked myself about how I write, the format it goes in, the end result, what am I trying to do? I've wondered about that for you because of three things. One, the journalism background. Two, the coming here as a nonfiction writer. And three, the taking a poetry workshop in the MFA program to think about writing in a different way. And then all those three things about writing, there's your life and the thing that's driven you. Food, gardening, now hunting, getting closer to your food. Does that stuff somehow make the writing what it is, or does the writing exist independent of it? Is it the content of the writing? Does that make sense?
For me, life and history are the writing. I'm not an imaginative writer, I don't think.
Oh yes, I remember you once said, I have no imagination.
Well, yeah, and that's not entirely accurate because, I mean,
but the material is from the real life.
Yeah, and I actually have a really hard time manufacturing even the thing that needs to pair a couple things up if it didn't happen. Or I think perhaps, I think perhaps that's why I'm extremely interested in Blackfeet place names in the place that I grew up. Because I feel like if I'm going to write about those places, I need to know that. Even if I don't necessarily say, and then this mountain, and then this mountain, and then this mountain, and then this mountain. Or get into the stories, but for myself, I feel like I need to know what's real. And there are so many levels of real in a place where multiple cultures have existed. And teasing out how to put all of that into some words on a page that can help someone experience the multiplicity of that kind of experience is, I think it's why I keep writing, trying to decode that.
Unlike you, you were born in Choteau, right? Or
Choteau.
Is that the correct way?
More with
Choteau,
a D.
Choteau, Montana. I am not native to this area that I live in now. I've been in Wyoming a long time. I've actually lived in Wyoming longer than you've been alive. You know, it's really interesting on that front because before I came to Wyoming, I never wrote anything about the place I lived.
Oh, really?
That wasn't how writing worked. I didn't write because of the place I was. I liked the place I was fine. That was the Pacific Northwest. And I love those places very much and spent a lot of time outdoors, hiking, cycling, having a life in that place. But nothing drove me to write about it. I didn't feel like it was the source of writing in any way. The source was language, or the source was other writing, or the source was stories I'd heard, or the source was nutty ideas I had, or the source was invention. But when I came here, suddenly I was in a place that I didn't know very well, and I wasn't completely comfortable here, and my sense of what it meant to be a person might have been at odds sometimes with people who did live here and had lived here a long time. There were political and social values that were different from mine when I first came here. And that tension, I think, was really engaging. And I began trying to grapple with that tension and understand my place in a place that wasn't the natural place. It was more like, how am I here? And it caused me to write. So that idea that a writer is in tension with something, doesn't have to be place. It could be in a tension with language. There are people whose entire careers as writers are based on some tension about the language itself. and others about place, a place that they are grappling with in some way to understand, or maybe something they do dislike, or particular manifestations of human activity that they're troubled by and want to grapple with. There's something about a dynamic tension for a writer that's interesting.
It's interesting to me that you came to Wyoming and experienced that tension, because I think it was coming back to where I grew up with a very different and I think broader set of perspectives to experience it through that generated that tension for me. It's a landscape that in truth I did not know well until I came back to it.
You were the famous manifestation of you can't go home, right? When you went home, you were different. And home had changed, you had changed.
I think of it as a sort of runaway interpretation of the prodigal son parable. Not, let's never mind what he did with himself while he was gone, but while he was away from home, he learned about a different culture and learned a whole bunch of new perspectives. And when he came back home, even though the parable doesn't spend a whole lot of time on it, there's no way home was the same for him. It couldn't possibly have been. He was different, and everything he saw about it was different. And I think I'm really fascinated with this idea that you have to leave a place sometimes to understand it, to understand your relationship to it, to even recognize that you may want to understand those relationships. And for me, writing is a way of getting at these relationships that are kind of new to me with that place. You and I seem to be getting into a bunch of conversations about hunting lately, which is interesting because of your background as a rancher and a vegetarian, and interesting to me because of my background as someone very interested also in where my food comes from, but a committed hunter or huntress.
Whichever you like.
So I know you wrote an essay about being a rancher and a vegetarian.
All that stuff about ranching, when you say you're a rancher, that's really like, please don't say that to ranchers. That would really flip them out. I worked for about 10 years on my father-in-law's ranch. I had some background. My family, like a lot of American immigrant families, mine are Norwegian immigrants largely, to the U.S., were farmers. So I spent a lot of time. My childhood summers were all on my mother's farm. And then as an adult, as a graduate student, I had an uncle who farmed near where I went to graduate school, so I did work with him. But when I came to Wyoming, I started doing the ranch work, largely repairing windmills. And these windmills are almost entirely gone now in Wyoming. They were classic old windmills that you'd see pictures of on the prairie. You know, a tower going up, a metal tower with a ladder up the side and a little tiny platform at the top to stand on, and the spinning blade with the tail.
And they were water pumps.
They were to provide water to stock, to animals. So we had 19 of them on my father-in-law's ranch, 4 Mile, the ranch is called. And I was largely a windmill repairman, maintenance man, workover man, all that kind of stuff. And part of that was because my father-in-law at the time was growing older. He'd been struck by lightning twice working on the ranch. And one time he was unconscious for about 24 hours. Nobody knew where he was. It was way before cell phones. You know, they did have two-way radios in the pickups at the time. And there was a little landing strip at the ranch too, because they flew small planes. You know, these ranches in northern Wyoming are gigantic arid lands ranches. But I also began working a little with cows. You know, the sheep business was really huge here. I'm going to get to hunting, I promise.
Okay.
And sheep went downhill through the 70s, 80s, 90s. There was a gigantic storm here in the spring of '83, 5 days of snow continuously and blowing. Started April 30th, went to May 4th, and about half the sheep in Johnson County died. The ranch I'm talking about is northern Wyoming, not down here in Laramie where we're talking. So a lot of ranchers shifted completely after that. And then wool subsidies stopped in '96 or '7. That was the end of that too, and everybody shifted to cattle, and I started working cattle. And I had become a vegetarian in college. I grew up in an ordinary household. Actually, we ate a lot of meats that were to me now. You know, we ate kidney and liver and heart and tongue. I can remember opening the refrigerator and seeing a big giant chunk of tongue on a plate in the refrigerator. My mother would make these slices for sandwiches. Anyway, I was riding with my wife Margot down a long hill. We had moved a small group of cows from a pasture that was isolated, not contiguous with the main body of the ranch. So there's a pasture it was about 6,000 acres, and you had to go across another person's ranch. So we were moving these cows. It was a full day's riding. We were coming down a long hill going southeast, so the western sun was setting. My wife was to my right on one side of these cows, and I was on this other side away from her. So when I looked across at her, all I could see was a black silhouette right from the setting sun.
And the dust was
cows
probably
and
glowing.
yes, it
Sure.
was August.
Yeah.
Dust and all of that. So I remember looking over at her, and I said, geez, it's beautiful. Isn't it beautiful, these cows and this dust and this setting sun and this mountain range, because we're just off, it's east of the Bighorn Mountains.
Okay.
And her riding, and the silhouette, the weird silhouette where you can't really see. It could be any human being. It's a dark horse and rider. And she looked back at me and she said, yeah, it's beautiful. It's really too bad it's about killing. Because that's what we do. You know, you raise these cows and then you kill them so people can eat them. And I thought about that a lot, and the ironies of being a vegetarian who was a cattle rancher or worked on a cattle ranch, you know. And I started thinking about that and other ironies of life. You've thought about that in the things you've written about becoming, you call it an adult onset hunter.
Right.
A very weird term, adult onset hunter. Maybe you can explain that to us at some point. But I just started thinking about it. And I began to try to write about contradictions in life. And the first contradiction was this one. What does it mean that you do this work that's about something you claim you don't participate in, and yet you are? It's sort of a small moment of realizing how we're implicated in all kinds of things that may not be what we planned, what we thought was the best thing philosophically or ethically, the ways in which we work with people who don't have the same views we have or the same backgrounds, and so their concept of the ordinary and normal may be very different from our concept of the ordinary and normal. Anyway, that's what got me going, writing that essay. When I first came to Wyoming and met my wife's family are Basque immigrants to Wyoming, first Basque people coming to the northern part of the state, and part of a really deep Basque community for the last 100 years. My wife's grandmother, interestingly, this is back to meat and vegetarian stuff, she was really quite disappointed that her granddaughter would have something to do with a person who was a vegetarian. And so at meals, she would guarantee that there was always almost nothing but meat. We had a Thanksgiving dinner where every single thing in the dinner had meat in it. It was like
even the salad, if there had been one.
Everything. The green beans had bacon in them, and the salad had ham in it, and you know, the potatoes had chunks of meat in it, and everything. And I remember at that point, my wife's mother saying, "Oh, you're right. There's more to it than just the way she cooks." So there's all that. The vegetarian thing is really shocking, you know.
Especially for this region.
Yeah. This has to do a little bit with writing. I mentioned to you that piece on doing ranch work and being a vegetarian was published in Orion magazine, which is a magazine that has a lot to do with nature and our relationship to the earth. And they had done a special issue, I think they called it The Future of Hunting. And they had several different writers wrote essays having to do with something about hunting. And mine drew a lot of attention about this contradiction, this conflict, the vegetarian ranch hand kind of thing. And tons of people contacted me. It was interesting how many people were taken by the topic and the problem of the topic. And indeed, publishers too, which is interesting about thinking about you here as an MFA candidate at the university in writing, that I got all these letters from editors and agents saying, do you have a book? Because a vegetarian cowboy book, that we can sell. You know, there was something clear about maybe you can write, but really, at least as important as if you can write, is this a saleable topic?
Yeah.
Is this something that we can latch onto in some way and make sales? Because the public will be interested. And there was something charming to people about the irony of this particular thing.
And you weren't tempted to make the book?
No, I've always felt as a writer that many, many novels I read, I feel were really great short stories. And I thought, you know, our publishing system demands that you publish novels. I know a lot of writers who love writing short stories, but it's much harder to sell short stories, both in the publishing world and to general reader audience out in the United States, they prefer reading novels, apparently. They sell better. Novels do better in the world. And I remember saying to somebody, I wrote the essay, but I think that's it. Because the essay is, I don't know what, maybe 15 pages, or it's a long way from being a book-length kind of thing.
Sure.
But it makes me also think about your work here as a writer, because you came here specifically as a nonfiction writer, correct? And now you're doing some work with poetry that's very different from the work you did that were essays with very clear points about, say, things, the way we treat animals. I've read several of your things that have to do with the management of animals, human treatment of the animals with whom they live and how they manipulate them for their own ends. So it must be a huge shift to think about that. And in fact, you're doing the opposite. You're finding your way towards ever more unsaleable writing.
I know.
So what about genre? You wrote these nonfiction essays. Now you're trying to turn them into poems.
I know.
You've often been like whacking. You're like some, I don't know, untrained barber going after
For real.
and I've thought about that because
fair.
the very first book I published was a collection of poems. And when it came out, some reviewers liked it. But many reviewers who, while liking it, also said, they're really nice, they're engaging, they're whatever positive words they use, but they're not poems. They're too prose-like to be poems. So I, of course, was not particularly concerned. I didn't know if it mattered. If people liked reading them and the reviewers thought they were good of something or other, why worry? So my second book I wrote without line breaks. I just said, well, we'll just write them as margin to margin, prose, but they were really, really short. So the book came out, and the publisher put on the title page where it says name of book and then a novel by or short stories by. It said Tales by my name. And the first review of the book said they were the most lovely prose poems. So the genre thing, I've been interested in that too. And of course, you know that I have written
Across the
poems,
genre.
stories, essays,
Right.
journalism, all that. And I think now I do have a clear sense of the distinction between them. Things that aren't meant to be poems and things that aren't meant to be stories, that they have to be in another form. So I guess I've come to believe there are differences. There are clear sensibility and ways of handling language differences. And
Well,
when I think it's
I've only published one thing that wasn't prose. I have a poem that's coming out in an anthology this fall, and it wasn't a poem that was derived from prose. It was written as a poem long before I had even considered that writing poems might be productive for my prose writing. And for me, I think genre is useful only insofar as it helps me understand better what I'm trying to do. And I think I learned this lesson in a really interesting way living in Quebec City. Interacting with French speakers, especially Francophones from France, trying to explain to them the kind of writing that I did. They don't have a term for nonfiction writing in French.
You mean for the kind of feature, not journalistic?
Right, but like literary essay sort of stuff.
essay.
There isn't a word for that, at least that any of them
It's
could
not
ever
just
come up with.
essay? What's an essay then?
Yes, I suppose essay, but to us, nonfiction is broader than just essays,
Yeah,
right?
that's true. That's true.
Right, and yeah, they didn't have a word for it, and we had many very interesting discussions about that. And I thought, here's an example. If we want to talk about language and writing, here's an example of exactly how important language can be. It frames how you can even understand a thing.
You mean there's no word for it, so how do you do it?
Exactly.
Yeah. I don't know. What are you thinking about all that?
Well, I know one thing I'm getting out of thinking about the content I'm writing in essays through a poetic lens is that I'm doing a better job, and maybe that's mostly thanks to the people that are reading it, honing in on major themes and recognizing what parts of the essay are maybe getting in the way of someone understanding a theme. And for example, we just had a conversation about one of the poems that I'd written, and it hadn't even occurred to me that an underlying message of it was this notion of encroachment and trespass But I grew up in Blackfeet country, and for years I've been trying to figure out how, as a white writer whose family is part of why the Blackfeet are no longer there, not directly, but we came next. We came next, and here we are, and we're right in the middle of a prime hunting ground and wintering area that they would have used historically. And the conversation that we had the other night about this notion of encroachment and trespass, where I was describing hunting on my grandpa's property and how it's bordered by a whole bunch of other private properties where we don't have permission to hunt, and you have to be very careful about the boundaries. The notion of sort of juxtaposing that kind of possible trespass with this historical trespass is not a revelation, but it's an opportunity, I think, to get at some of the things that, for me, feel complicated, loaded, potentially really problematic to write about.
To write about such things.
Right. And so I think even if I never become a poet, and it's not necessarily a goal of mine to be an identifiable certain sort of genre writer, even so, thinking about things in poetic terms and distilling something down to an essence and an idea, and then figuring out just how much you need to flesh that out to bring a reader into that thinking realm. And also, for me, it's really important that someone has an experience of being in the places that I'm writing about.
What, you mean you want to give them some real feel for the place?
Yes, I can't make them go sit there.
Yeah.
But I want them to feel like they're sitting there, because I wouldn't be writing if it weren't for this place that I'm trying to figure out my relationship to, and the history and how I relate to that.
Commit yourself to the thing. Then eventually, maybe somebody will come to accept that what you're doing is done in a serious, sincere, and respectful manner, because you care about something.
Right.
You care about something.
It's a puzzle for me right now because I don't live there.
Yeah,
I may never live
living
there again.
Yeah.
And I think about the language and the names and the places when I'm out doing something like hunting,
Yeah.
People have been hunting animals there for an awfully long time, and they used to have very particular ways they went about it that are seriously different from how we do it now.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not that you can't write about something without knowing everything that someone else thinks about it. It's not that. And it's not that I think that I need to crack a cultural code to get it right. It's just something that increasingly, as I've written about the place, and especially here in the MFA, written about it and tried to communicate about it to other people who have no connection to it, or the various cultures that have been there, I think about it more, a lot more than I used to.
Yeah.
I think that may be why the stuff I'm writing about right now finally feels like it's moving somewhere, because I'm having conversations with other people about it, and I'm finding out what aspects of what I think is important to communicate about that place communicate readily, and what kinds of what parts of the complexities of that place am I going to need to put a lot more effort into articulating or mulling over. Sure, so they'll get it, or that they'll even be engaged enough to want to engage with it. And I think it's really interesting that you're talking about the other lives, because I suppose it's been about a decade now that I've been trying to decide. So I agree with you. I don't think writing is my only life.
Yeah, yeah.
Being in the MFA program has made me consider whether and how writing will be a more formalized part of my life in the future. I've done some journalism work, like you were mentioning, but never really thought about fully making my living as a writer or my identity as a writer, more as a communicator, and doing that across all of these different domains. So now the MFA has given me another choice, and I may just choose it again. You don't and, not an instead of.
In something you wrote, you talked about someone else mentioning how a drawing is more helpful for understanding an animal or a plant than a photograph of it. That the drawing actually simplifies and brings to the foreground the thing that you need in order to be able to do identification.
I've been trying to figure out how, as an art science integration consultant and working with educators and researchers who want to use art, mostly drawing, to communicate about science, to enhance their scientific research processes, to get them to think or look more closely at something, to help them teach students, to provide drawing as a tool for students in classrooms, in science classrooms. Students aren't taught really to draw anymore, and it's a kind of astonishing thing given how integral drawing was to the history of science. And there's a lot of great research that substantiates the importance of that sort of multimodal, visceral way of thinking about a study organism or a concept as a learning and exploration and communication process. For me, drawing and writing work in very similar ways. And my guess is that it's like that for you with music and writing.
I've actually wondered about that.
Okay.
But I've wondered, why are the two separated so much in my mind? And what does it mean? And I've wondered, one thing I do take, I think, from the music, though, is something about purpose and the who it's for part. Because the more I think about the way the musical part of my life works, the performance in community settings, if you play in a room for 20 people or 80 people or 100 or 4, there's this really rich experience of this thing, the art form, with the people that they receive and feedback. If it's dancing or singing or clapping or nodding, there's something physical that is engendered from it. And it doesn't matter if 8 million people saw the last K-pop thing on YouTube. It's really about that thing happening right there. So that has informed a lot of my thinking about trying to write. Who is it for? In what context will it go to people? Writing's very odd because, again, you do it alone mostly. There's very little collaborative writing. And you send it to the world through multiples of the same thing.
Creative writing, right?
Novels, plays, poems, whatever would be our literary artifacts in the world. They go out there and people are concerned about, you got to sell enough of them to make a living. You need to sell 500,000 copies, 1 million copies, something like that. None of that happens for music. It's quite possible to make a decent living as a musician in many, many different ways. Through certain forms of teaching, through certain kinds of community constructs for music, versus the kind of big performance version of it, the touring musician playing in front of 20,000 people at a pop on a tour. Both those things can operate simultaneously, and neither is going to destroy the other one. But writing's much harder. It doesn't quite have that. It's not possible to sit in the room and make the living by reading poems to people in a group of 20.
But shouldn't it be?
I don't know, but it's a really interesting part of it. So they've remained isolated worlds in a weird way.
In how
in my
you
life.
experience them.
And I try to bring them together. I try to use the music a little bit in writing. Sometimes I've done music performances that have literature, and especially now the Basque music, because I'm very much involved in a project now to present to the world traditional Basque music of Wyoming, and to present some new music, to write some that is in the style or somehow resonant with or resonates from the older music. So we just finished producing this CD, and my daughter and I have been going around doing a lot of presentations, and we read material while performing Basque music too. So they're like literary music events, and people seem to like them very, very much, but they are kind of sit-down performances. There's the performer and there's the audience. So they're very different than the party band playing for people to dance. But they still have a kind of connection, and I don't know how to get that with literature. It's a different, private. Often literature means I'm sitting in my room alone. I'm reading the book by myself. I'm having this magical experience, but on my own. So I almost feel, again, it's like, I don't know how I'd live one or the other.
Maybe that's why we come back to places like this MFA program. We circle back, I mean.
As writers, you mean?
Yes. Those of us who do want a more communal experience with literature, that a place like the University of Wyoming's creative writing program gives us an opportunity to bridge that private and communal
In some way,
experience that we have with
At least
literature.
we can talk to each other
Exactly.
about literature and
Exactly.
writing, you know,
Yeah.
even if we can't play tunes with
Right.
each other.
Right.